single death is a tragedy. A million deaths is a statistic. Tonight, we explore the life of history's most powerful dictator, a man whose very name became a warning whispered across half the world. Joseph Stalin. To some, he was the leader who saved civilization from fascism, who turned a backwards empire into a superpower. To others, he was the century's greatest monster, architect of famines that killed millions and purges that destroyed a generation. He rose from nothing, a cobbler's song with a withered arm and a pock. By the time he died, he controlled the fate of 800 million people. His path from the seminary to the Kremlin traced through revolution and civil war, and the systematic, ruthless destruction of every rival and friend. Lenin warned the party to remove him. Trotsky called him a mediocrity. They all underestimated Demon, who collected power the way others collected stamps, carefully, methodically, until he held every piece that mattered. The boy nicknamed Suso, who sang in their church choir, would become the Dictator war dynamited those same churches. The revolutionary who fought the Tsar's oppression would create a police deficit, made the old empire look gentle. Had defeated Hitler, carved up Europe, and did believing everyone around him was plotting his destruction. Perhaps he was. His own daughter said his finalgisser was lifting his hand as if cursing them all. Before we begin this journey through one of history's darkest lives, I want to know what you think. Was Stalin an accessory evil who modernized Russia and saved it from destruction? Or was he a paranoid murderer who set his country back generations? Let me know in the comments. And if you are finding value in these explorations of history's most complex figures, please consider subscribing. It helps others discover these stories. Now settle back, dim the lights and prepare to meet the man who built socialism in one country on a foundation of bones. The revolutionary who became a dictator, and, in his own mind, at least almost, a god. This is the bedtime biography of Joseph Stalin, Chapter 1, The Boy from Gori. The story begins in a small Georgian town where the truth itself was Iob Washali entered thrilled on December 6, 1878, though he'd later trim a year from his. The official Soviet record would claim 1879. Stalin himself made this decision in the 1920s. Already practicing the art of rewriting his story on the smallest canvas, his own birth certificate. Gori sat in the shadow of the Caucasus Mountains, a place where empires had collided for centuries. The town's medieval fortress overlooked narrow streets where Georgian, Armenian, Russian, and Turkish voices mixed in the market squares. Here, among Thecabell stones and Orthodox churches, legends sprouted about young Suso. Some whispered he was the boosted son of a local prince. Others claimed Emperor Alexander III himself had fathered the child during some improbable Georgian adventure. The truth was both simpler and harder. His mother, Ki, worked her fingers raw as a washerwoman. His father, Bezo, made boots and drank. But Bezo wasn't the simple brute that Soviet hagiography would later paint. The Mon could read Georgian, spoke Russian, Armenian, and Turkish. In his better years, he ran a successful workshop with apprentices and steady orders. The family lived in a brick house with a cellar and wine storage. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't so was their third attempt at a child. The first two boys had died before their first birthdays, making him precious cargo in his mother's eyes. Then came the unraveling. Basso's drinking intensified. The workshop failed. The beatings. One friend remembered Basso grabbing little Suso by the legs and hurling him to the floor so hard that blood pooled in the child's urine 4 days. Another time, Keck threw herself between them, taking blows meant for Herson until neighbors pulled the drunk cobbler away. Eventually, Besa disappeared entirely, drifting between Tiff's factories, leaving his family to serve on Keck's work. Scrubbing other people's laundry, disease and accident marked the boy as surely as poverty. Smallpox arrived when Was 7, leaving his face cratered like a battlefield map. Then came the carriage accident. Or maybe it was a sledge. The stories vary that mangled his left arm. The local hospital's treatment made things worse. Blood poisoning set in. The arm withered, growing shorter than the right, bending at an awkward angle he'd spend his life trying to hide in photographs. He had another secret too. 2 toes on his left foot were fused together. A detailed Soviet autopsy would confirm decades later. Yet so wasn't some Denzian orphans huffling through cobweaved misery. His mother's fierce ambition lifted him above his circumstances, while other boys his age worked in fields or workshops. He attended school. The Chukvani family, local nobility with a priest in their ranks, took an interest in the bright scarred boy. Father Christopher Chekvani pulled strings to get him into the Gori Theological School in 1888. The priest's children tutored him in Russian, opening doors that most Georgian peasant boys never even knew existed. At school, Suso thrived. The record show, a model student earning excellent marks in sacred history, Orthodox catechism, and liturgical chant. His voice rang pure in the church choir. He memorized prayers in Old Church Savonisi, the Russian teacher. A disciplinarian boys called Dejam made him a classroom assistant. This was the first taste of authority, however small, and he savored it. Decades later, in 1944, Stalin would remember these schoolmates with unexpected tenderness. He sent money to old friends from Gori, notes written in Georgian and signed with his childhood name. Greka, he wrote to one, accept this small gift from me. Yours, Suso. By then he'd already murdered, but something in him still remembered being 9 years old and sinking in the church choir while his mother watched from the women's section. Hercules' hands folded in prayer. Stalin himself would later claim his parents did not treat me badly by any means. Peculiar statement from a man whose father beat him, unconscious, and whose mother worked herself to exhaustion. But perhaps that's how it seemed to him. Just the normal texture of life in 1880s Georgia, where most families buried half their children and wives expected bruises. Or perhaps he was already practicing the art he'd perfect as transforming suffering into strength through sheer force of narrative will. Chapter 2. The Failed Seminarian. September 1894. Suso entered the Tiflis Theological Seminary, carrying his mother's dreams in a small cloth bundle. The building grows like a fortress above the city, all stone corridors and echoing prayers. Here they would make priests out of Georgian boys. Also what they actually created was something else entirely. At first, he flourished. Fifth in his. By the second year, behavior marked excellent. The teachers nodded approvingly as he recited catechisms in perfect Russian, but the seminary operated like a precentress in holy robes. They woke at 7 tobles. Prayers before breakfast, prayers before lessons, prayers before the vinsoup they called dinner. After 5 o'clock roll call, the doors locked. No one in, no one out. The monks searched their rooms without warning, rifling through belongings for forbidden books or Georgian newspapers. Speaking Georgian earned punishment. Writing in Georgian earned worse. The Russian Empire was civilizing. Thes provincial boys, one prohibited syllable at a time. A classmate remembered we felt as if we were in. The walls pressed closer each day. Suso found his escape in books, not holy texts, but novels smuggled through seminars, black market of ideas. Had discovered Alexandra Casby's The Patricide, a tale of a Georgian noble named Kabawo fought Russian oppressors with mountain justice and a sharp blade. The name stuck to him like a shadow. Koba, his friends, started calling him that, and he wore it like armor. Poetry poured from him during Thosieli's seminary years. 6 piece published in Georgian newspapers between 1895 and 96. Sweet earnest verses about motherland and morning light. Blossom, lovely land. He wrote, exalt, country of Georgians. The words seem almost impossibly innocent now, coming from the boy who would starve Ukraine. But poetry wasn't enough. By his 3rd year, he joined an illegal discussion circle where seminarians read Victor Hugo by candlelight. His grades began their slow collapse. The conduct journal filled with infractions, missed prayers, bad behavior during liturgy, returning late from who knows where. He was attending secret meetings with railway workers, discovering Marx's premise that history moved through collision and struggle toward paradise. The inspection records from 1899 tell story's end. Confined to books confiscated, more infractions piling up. In May, the seminary expelled him for failing to appear at examinations for unknown reasons. The official language disguised what everyone knew. They were eager to rid of him without scandal. Stalin would later tell a German writer that the seminar's Jesuitical method had made him a revolutionary or perhaps he was already inclined toward rebellion and the seminary simply showed him what to Either way, Keck's dream of Herson in priest's robes died in those corridors. Her so walked out of the seminary doors and into the underground where men plotted by lamplight to tear down. The Entire World, Chapter 3, The Professional Lovena. After the seminary expelled him, Sousa took a job at the Tiflis meteorological station, recording temperatures and rainfall like any ordinary clerk. But ordinary was never his destination. Soon he vanished into the underground, that shadow world where men lived on false papers and slept in different beds each night. The local police files describe him perfectly, conducting himself with complete caution and constantly looking over his shoulder as he walks. This waste revolutioner's dance, alwaiting for the police tail, always ready to slip around a corner, and he moved to Bartum, the oil port on the Black Sea, where workers' grievances bubbled thick as crude. March 9th, 1902. The strikes he'd helped organize turned into something darker. Troops opened fire on the workers. 13 dead at least, maybe more. Blood mixed with oil in the police swept through the city afterward, and they caught him in Thurnet. His first arrest in his cell, he scribbled notes to relatives, begging for false alibis. He petitioned the authorities about his worsening cogent, his poor mother's helpless situation. They weren't moved. Siberia swallowed him for the first time. 1903. Eastern reaches where winter lasted 9 months. An escape meant death by cold. If the wolves didn't find you first. Bov escaped anyway in early 1904, making his way back to the Caucasus just as the Social Democrats were tearing themselves in half. Lenin wanted professional, disciplined, and ruthless. The Menviks wanted something gentler, more democratic. Suzo's choice was, never in doubt. The 1905 revolution erupted across the empire. He was everywhere and nowhere, setting up printing presses in basement, organizing what he called fighting squads. This work caught Lenin's attention. Soon, he was traveling to party congresses in Stockholm and London, meeting the leader himself in Berlin. They talked through the night about the beautiful violence that would birth a new world. June 1907. His friend Caro and some others robbed a bank. Transport in Tiflis's main square. 250,000 rubles for the party coffers. 40 people dead. The author of our story concludes, Stalin knew about it, helped hide it from local comrades, but didn't plan it himself. Still, the heat from that robbery forced him to flee to Baku, where he disappeared into the oil fields' perpetual twilight. The arrests came regularly now. 19,081,910. Each time, rumors followed him back from prison. Was he a police agent? Thor dismisses this, noting the evidence was later exposed as forgery, but the suspicion clung to him like oil smoke. By 1912, he'd joined Lenin's Central Committee, close enough to taste it. He'd also chosen a new name for his articles. Not Cobra anymore, something harder, more Russian. Stalin, Man of Steel, Chapter 4. The Siberian Limbo, February 1913. The police came for Stalin one last time. The betrayer was Roman Malinsky, a fellow Bolshevik who reported every secret to the Irana. They sentenced Stalin to 4 years in Turkansky Krai, a place so remote that maps sometimes forget to include it. The Arctic Circle loomed just north, and winter temperatures dropped to 37 below. His letters from those first months read like messages from a drowning man. Feckald intensifies, he wrote. I have a suspicious cough. No money for bread or kerosene. My hardship grows by the hour. I'm in a desperate situation. I can't stand it any longer. The party tried to organize his escape, but Malinovsky whispered their plans to the police before they could unfold. March 1914. They moved him even deeper into nowhere. A village called Kirka, where the sun disappeared for months, and the river froze solid enough to drive. His companion in exile was Yakov, another Bolshevik who believed in revolution and clean dishes. They lasted about 3 weeks as housemates. The problem was the dog. Stalin had adopted a local mutt named Yashka who followed him everywhere. After meals, Stalin would set his plates on the dirt floor and let Yashka lick them clean. This was frontier efficiency. Spurred saw differently. That fellow had a passion for cleanliness. Stalin recalled years later, still amazed by the memory. Sverdlov called him too much of an individualist in practical matters. They moved into separate houses and stopped speaking gently. With off gone, Stalin moved in with the Parapigian family. Soon he was sharing more than their cabin. Lydia Prapagina was 14 years old when their relationship. The local policeman, an ethnician like Stalin, looked the other way. When Stalin got into a fist fight with his guard over the girl, the policeman took Stalin's side and assigned him a friendlier guard, Nemed, for whom Stalin would later write glowing recommendations. The days blurred together, fishing through holes in the ice, setting traps for rabbits, sharing vodka with locals who'd forgotten why they'd been exiled in the first place. He'd brought books initially, but they gathered dust. No articles flowed from his pen. no letters to the party leadership. Trotsky would later search for traces of Stalin's intellectual life during this period and find nothing but silence. By 1915, Lenin had forgotten his excellent comrade so completely that he sent notes to colleagues asking, "Do you remember Koba's last name?" "We've forgotten." The future dictator had dissolved into Siberian whiteness, becoming just another exile. Counting days until 1917, he wrote one last letter to Malinovsky, still not knowing the man was a traitor, swearing on his dog's life that he would serve out his term. This was Stalin's deepest disappearance, his most complete erasure from his, while Europe tore itself apart in the Great War. While Lenin wrote furious pamphlets in Swiss cafes, Stalin sat by a smoky fire in Kirka, playing cards with his guard and waiting for winter toned. The man of steel had become a ghost, haunting a place that buried, forgotten by everyone who mattered, until revolution came and changed everything. Chapter 5. The Revolution of 1917. February 1917 arrived like a fever breaking. The ZAR abdicated, the empire collapsed. Stalin heard their news in Kirka and immediately no need to wait for official release papers. Russia had bigger problems now. He caught rides on sledge-sand riverboats, racing toward Petrograd, where history was being written by the hour. He arrived to find the Belaviks in Dasare. Lenin was still in Switzerland. Thepati's Petrograd leaders were combed through events without clear direction. Stalin and his old friend Kamv took control of Pravda, the party newspaper, and immediately steered it to admiration. They wrote that Russia needed to pass through proper capitalist development before socialism could bloom. Support the provisional government conditionally, continue fewer defensively. This was orthodox Marxism, sensible and gradual. Then Lenin's letters started arriving from exile, each one more radical than the last. No support for the Bush, immediate peace. All Poeto, the Soviets. Stalin and Kamv, Thothia leader, had lost touch with reality. They edited his articles before publishing them, softening the sharp edges, adding qualifiers where Lenin had written absolutes. They were trying to save him from himself. April 3rd, Lenin's train pulled into Finland station. The crowd went wild, but the speech he gave that night stunned even his own party. His hypothesis demanded immediate socialist revolution. Right now, no waiting for his. The Bolshevik leadership listened in bewilderment. One old comrade muttered that Lenin had gone mad. Stalin sat silent, calculating. Within days, Stalin pivoted completely. At the April Party conference, Lenin personally endorsed him. "We have known Comrade Koba for very many years. He handles any responsible job well." Stalin secured his spot on the Central Committee and promptly abandoned every moderate position he'd held the week before. He called it creative Marxism. Rules were for people who wanted Tolos. "We must reject the obsolete notion that only Europe can show us the way," he declared, as if he'd never thought otherwise. Summer 1917. The July days erupted in street demonstrations that nearly destroyed Thebes. The government blamed them for chaos. Lenin fled to Finland. Kamv was arrested. Stalin, less famous and thus less wanted, stayed free and useful. He arranged Lenin's hiding places, moving him between safe houses like a chess piece, one step ahead of the police. October approached. The party split over whether to seize power. Zinoviev and Kam went public with their opposition, warning that insurrection meant Lenin exploded, demanding their But Stalin defended them in Pravda, writing that despoti disagreants, overall we remain like-minded. It was a rare moment of defying Lenin, choosing old friendships over revolutionary purity. Meanwhile, Trotsky had emerged as their evolution's brilliant star, organizing the Military Revolutionary Committee, giving speeches that set crowds on fire. Stalin watched from the shadows, learning when the Winter Palace fell on October 25th. Stalin wasn't leading any charges. He was in a room somewhere, editing copy for next day's paper. But he'd learned Lenin's essential lesson. In revolutionary moments, the most radical position usually wins. Moderation was death. Extremism was survival. He would never forget it. Chapter 6. Forged in Civil War. The October Revolution was just the overture. What followed was 3 years of civil war that killed 8 million people through combat, starvation, and disease, 4 times what Russia lost in the Great War. This was the furnace that forged Stalin into something harder than his revolutionary dreams ever imagined. Summer 1918. The Bolsheviks sent Stalin to Tsaritsyn to procure grain for starving Moscow. He found the city under siege and immediately exceeded his orders. Hess's military command, though he'd never led troops, he dismissed the professional officers Trotsky had sent, calling them lifeless pen pushers and cobblers in furious telegrams to Lenin. These former Tsarist officers knew how to fight, but Stalin trusted his drinking buddy Clement Voroshilov, Marathon, any military academy graduate. When his amateur tactics nearly lost Thessaly, Stalin discovered his signature move. He invented a conspiracy. Secret enemies had sabotaged them from within. The arrests began immediately. Former officers, engineers, anyone with soft hands and clean fingernails. They dragged an engineer named Alexei Vento, the basement of the secret police headquarters. A fellow prisoner, Konstantin Makovsky, later described finding Alexei with his face totally covered by a mask of blood. Guards beating him with rifle butts and boots, even after he'd collapsed. Stalin ordered a prison barge, anchored in the Volga, 400 people packed inside with one latrine and no food. Some went mad from thirst. Others threw themselves into the river. Stalin and Voroshilov took credit for every execution, sending proud reports to Moscow about the vigilance against counter-revolution. When the real military situation grew they simply shot more traitors and requested more ammunition. Trotsky, building his professional Red Army, watched this chaos with growing golem. On October 4th, he telegraphed Lenin, "I categorically insist that Stalin we have a colossal superiority forces, but total anarchy at the top." Stalin fired back that Trotsky was protecting traitors from among military specialists. The two men would never forgive each other for what happened in Tsaritsyn. But Stalin learned something valuable in thought blood-soaked city. Competence was optional. If you had enough bullets, failure could always be blamed on him. Terror could substitute for. These weren't just emergency measures for wartime. They were tools you would carry forever. The Civil War created the Soviet Stiksna, not the workers' paradise Lenin had promised in his Swiss exile, but something harder and more desperate. Every institution was militarized. Every disagreement became potential. The Cheka, the secret police, executed more people in 3 years than the Tsarist regime had in the previous. This wasn't an aberration, it was the foundation. Stalin thrived in this atmosphere like a catfish in darkness. while Trotsky commanded armies and Lenin wrote theoretical justifications for Dictator. Stalin did the dirty work others avoided. He supervised grain requisitions that left peace. He ordered the execution of former comrades who'd chosen the wrong side. He learned that revolution wasn't about ideal. It was about who could be most ruthless when ruthlessness. The boy from Gori who'd written poetry about blossoming motherlands was gone. What emerged from the civil war was something else entirely. Chapter 7. The Grey Blur. After the civil war ended, Stalin held two seemingly minor posts. He ran the nationalities, commissariat, and Thuarkas and peasants' inspectorate. Neither job commanded armies or crowds. But power in the new Soviet state wasn't always where it appeared to be. The real game was being played between Lenin and Trotsky. By late 1920, Lenin grew nervous about Trotsky's influence in the party machinery. Stalin picked his side without hesitation. He helped Lenin orchestrate a purge after supporters at the 10th Party Congress in 1921. Loyalty like that earned rewards. April 1922. Lenin was already feeling the first ouches of the illness that would kill him. He needed someone to manage the party's daily operations, someone reliable and methodical. He created a new position, General Secretary of the Central Committee. The job sounded bureaucratic, almost boring. Stalin accepted it quietly from this grey office. Stalin controlled everything that mattered. He set Politburo agendas. He managed personnel appointments across the entire Soviet Union. Tens of thousands of officials suddenly owed their positions to his assistant, a Keynesian, wrote letters describing Stalin's firm hand and cunning nature. Hard as a nut, Nazidian marveled. It takes a while to understand what he's up to. A new phrase entered. Moscow's slang for officials awaiting assignments going under Stalin, while Trotsky gave speeches that made crowds roar, and Lenin wrote brilliant articles from his sick bed. Stalin sat in his office moving names around on lists. Each name was a debt. Each debt was a vote. The party apparatus was becoming his personal machine, one appointment at a time. His relationship with Lenin during this period was extraordinarily intimate. They shared jokes about Stalin's pipe smoking, Lenin calling him an Asian with. When Lenin's health collapsed in May 1922, he summoned Stalin with a terrible He wanted poison. The paralysis was coming, and Lenin preferred death to helplessness. Stalin refused gently, telling Lenin the doctors were still hopeful. Are you being deceitful? Lenin asked. Stalin replied, when have you ever seen me be? It was a moment of genuine tendons between two men who'd shed rivers of blood together. Lenin's sister, Maria, later confirmed this story. One of the few times Stalin showed something approaching compassion, but even as Stalin played the loyal Lenin, he was building something Lenin never intended. The party secretary was supposed to be a clerk, not a king. Yet every day, Stalin's control grew. He knew who drank too much, who had bourgeois parents, who'd supported the Mensheviks. In 1905, information was ammunition, and he was stockpiling enough to fight a war. The other Bolshevik leaders dismissed him as a grey blur, someone important in order to attend meetings, but not brilliant enough to matter. They spent their time debating theory and writing position papers. Stalin spent his time learning where every single party member's loyalty resided. He was buying the board. When Lenin's health finally fell, the grey blur would emerge from the shadows, and everyone would discover they already belonged to him. Chapter 8. The break with Lenin. Fall 1922. The partnership between Lenin and Stalin began to crack like ice under Spring Sunday. Lenin, watching from his sickbed, grew alarmed at how much power his general secretary had accumulated. The filing cabinets full of personnel records had become an empire. The first real fight erupted over the formation of the Soviet Union itself. Stalin wanted to absorb Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian Reich directly into Russia. Heckled it autonomization. Lenin read the proposal and exploded. This was great Russian chauvinism. Hesed the Tsarist Empire wearing red. Stalin told Kamenev they should stand up to Ilyich, but when Lenin stood firm, Stalin retreated. You didn't win fights with Lenin. Not yet. Then came the foreign trade monopoly dispute. Stalin wanted to loosen it. Lenin wanted it ironclad, to everyone's surprise. Lenin formed an alliance with Trotsky, his old rival. In a note to his wife, Kubskaya, Lenin urged Trotsky not to stop, but to continue the offensive. They were planning something together. These two giants, and Stalin was the target. Stalin found out about the secret communications. He telephoned Krupskaya and unleashed a stream of abuse. How dare she let Lenin work on Politxswan? The Politburo had ordered rest. The call lasted 4 minutes. Krupskaya was left, shaking. She'd been Lenin's partner since before Stalin could grow a proper moustache. And now this Georgian clerk was screaming at her. December 24th, 1922. Stalin announced an immediate acquisition of Soviet agriculture, not gradually, not voluntarily, but now and by force. 25 million peasant families would be herded onto collective arms, whether they wanted it or not. The next month, he declared something of the liquidation of the Kulaks Asa class. Kulak meant fist in Russian. Supposedly rich peasants who exploited their neighbors. But Stalin's definition expanded like spilled ink. Anyone with 2 cows was a kulak. Anyone who hired help during harvest. Anyone who resisted collectivization. The word became a death sentence that could be applied to anyone. Tens of thousands of urban activists poured into the countryside that winter. They came like an invading army, knowing nothing about farming, but everything about force. Their weapon was simple. Join the collective farm, or be branded a kulak. Lose everything. Face exiled to Siberia. Maybe face a bullet. The collectivization rate tells history in numbers. October 1929, 12% of households. February, 193,052%. 4 months to destroy a way of life that stretched back centuries. Peasants woke to find their grain confiscated, their tools declared communal property, their livestock driven into collective herds. The countryside exploded. 1930 saw nearly 14,000 instances of mass unrest. 3.5 million peasants rose up, especially in Ukraine, which accounted for almost half the rebellions. They rang church bells to summon neighboring villages. They took back their grain and animals. They dismantled the collective arms with their bare hands. Stalin sent Arunids to investigate. His report was clinical. Armed forces were Singmakian guns and in some places cannons. There are 100 killed and shot and a few hundred wounded. When the Ukrainian security chief asked for guidance, Stalin's response was brief. Act more decisively. The rebellions were crushed village by village. But the spring planting season was approaching, and without crops, even Stalin would starve. March 2nd, 1930, Stalin published Dizzy with Success in Pravda, a masterpiece of politicalcinism. The excesses of collectivization, he wrote, came from local officials who'd gotten carried away. They'd become dizzy with success. It wasn't his policy. That was wrong. Just these foolish subordinates who'd The peasants could leave the collective arms if they wished. They fled in millions. By May, collectivization had dropped back to 23%. The peasants planted their spring crops they always had on their own small plots. But Stalin was only buying time. Once the harvest was safely gathered, the assault resumed. By the end of 1931, the majority were trapped in the collective system again. The human cost was staggering. Families torn apart, entire villages emptied to Siberia. Between 1928 and 1933, the cattle population fell from 60 million to 33 million. Peasants lot their animals rather than surrender them. Better to eat meat tonight than give it to Stalin tomorrow. This was revolution from above. Imposed by urban communists who'd never touch its soil. They destroyed the most productive farmers, the ones who knew how to make things grow. What followed would be catastrophe on a scale even Stalin might not have imagined, though, knowing what know about him now, perhaps I imagined it perfectly. Chapter 12. The Terror Famine. The collective farms were machinist designate to fail. Peasants, who'd farmed their own plots for generations, now worked communal fields with no stake in the harvest. They knew the state would take everything anyway, so they work it slowly, carelessly, sometimes not at all. By 1932, the inevitable had arrived. Famine. This wasn't nature's cruelty. The author makes this absolutely clear. Stalin created this catastrophe through policy, then deepened it through choice. 5 to 7 million people would die, mostly in Ukraine and the North Caucasus, to regions that had resisted collectivization most fiercely. Stalin saw starvation as a weapon, and wielded it precisely. The writer, Mikhail Sholokhov, sent Stalin a letter describing what he'd seen in the villages. Peasants torture red tow, reveal hidden grain. Mock executions, hot irons pressed against skin. He wrote about a woman with a baby expelled from her home for failing to meet her quota. She wandered the villa through the night, begging to be let inside. No one dared help her. By morning, the infant had frozen to death in her arms. Stalin read the letter and responded with ice in his veins. The peasants were waging a quiet war against Soviet power, he wrote back. A war by starvation. They were the aggressors, not the victims. In his mind, Ukrainian peasants were doubly suspect. They were peasants, which made them backward. They were Ukrainian, which made them nationalist. Their suffering was therefore both deserved and useful. Procurement, brigades swept through dying villages like locusts. They took not just grain, but everything edible. Potatoes, beets, seeds for next year's planting. They probed the ground with metal rods, searching for buried food. The yummers that families had hidden to serve. Finding one meant arrest, maybe execution. The brigades left nothing behind but hunger. Secret police reports from 1933 describe scenes from hell. Parents eating their dead children, children eating their parents, entire villages where no living thing moved. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union exported 1.8 million tons of grain in 1932. The grain that could have saved millions went to buy foreign machinery for Stalin's factories. Refugees tried to flee to regions where food still existed. Stalin ordered palace cordons around the famine zones. Anyone caught leaving was sent back, toady. The cities needed to be protected from hungry peasants who might tell their stories. Better they die quietly, their villages out of sight. February 1933, the famine reached its peak. Stalin delivered a speech about the achievements of collectivization. The poor peasants, he declared, had attained material security in the collective farms. While millions starved, he celebrated their prosperity. When an American visitor mentioned thefamine privately, Stalin admitted some peasants were currently hungry, but blamed them for being parasites, and this was power without conscience. Stalin had learned during the Civil War that violence worked. Now he discovered something worse. Hunger was cheaper than bullets and quieter than executions. It could destroy millions while leaving buildings intact. The bodies could be plowed under, and next year's grain would grow from soil enriched by the dead. He'd found the perfect crime, one that left no fingerprints except on history itself. Chapter 13. Rehearsal for Terror. December 1st, 1934. Sergei walked through the corridors of the Smolny Institute in Lenin, the old finishing school where the Belaviks had planned their revolution. A young man named Leonid Nikolia waited in the hallway. One shot the back of the neck. Kirov was dead before he hit the floor. For decades, people have whispered that Stalin ordered the hit. Kirov was popular, charismatic, everything Stalin wasn't. The author examines the evidence carefully and concludes there's no proof Stalin arranged the murder. Nikolai was unstable, recently expelled from Thepati, carrying grievances like stones in his pocket. Sometimes a lone gunman is just a lone gunman. But Stalin turned Kirov's corpse into Aladar. Within hours, he was on a train to Leningrad, playing the grieving comrade while orchestrating the investigation. He told Security Chief Yarf exactly what to find. Look for murderers among Thesanovites. He ordered, not investigate, not discover. Look for them where Stalin had already decided they existed. The old oppositionists were rounded up. Zenonov and Komev, already defeated politically, now faced criminal charges. There was no evidence connecting them to Nikolia. Stalin didn't need evidence. He needed a narrative. Kirov had been killed by a vast conspiracy of former oppositions. Terrorists hiding behind party cards. The trials began immediately. December 1934, January 1935, dozens of alleged Zenovites were shot or sent to camps. But Stalin wasn't just punishing past opposition, he was establishing precedent. Political disagreement was now terrorism. Yesterday's debate was tomorrow's death sentence. The Kirov tributary, as it became known, spread beyond the opposition. Thousands of former nobles, priests, and Tsarist officials were swept from Leningrad and exile. The city had to be cleansed of unreliable elements. Anyone with the wrong background, the wrong connections, the wrong thoughts. Their security organs were learning to cast wide nets. Yet Stalin mixed terror with calculated oration. In 1935, he announced a new Soviet constitution, the most democratic in the world, he claimed. He declared that sons wouldn't answer for their father screams anymore. He even invited some exiled kulaks to return home. The seizing laws confused everyone, which weighs exactly the point. The security apparatus kept perfecting its methods. Show trials became theatrical productions. Defendants confessed to impossible crimes with rehearsed precision. They'd met with Trotsky on days he was probably elsewhere. They'd sabotaged factories that didn't exist. Truth became irrelevant. The performance was everything. This was the rehearsal period. Stalin was testing the machinery of terror, checking its gears and springs. Could party be made to believe obviouslies? Yes. Would old revolutionary scorns to being foreign spies with a now pressure? Yes. Would anyone dare defend the accused? No one did. By 1936, the rehearsals were ending. Stalin had learned what he needed. The state could manufacture any reality it chose. Former heroes could become traitors overnight. The impossible could become historical fact if repeated enough times. The stage was set for something unprecedented in human story. Not just terror, but total terror. Not just control, but absolute control. The Great Terror was coming. And Kirov's murder had shown Stalin exactly how to conduct it. Chapter 14. The Great Terror. Summer 1937, Stalin unleashed hell with a bureaucrat's precision. NKVD order number 000447 arrived at security offices across the Soviet Union on July 30th. It contained quotationary by region, numbers to be shot, numbers for the camps, like a production plan for death. The initial targets were the usual suspects: former kulaks back from exile, ex-priests, members of other political parties from before the revolution, common criminals. But the quotas could exceeded, and local officials eager to show their vigilance overfulfilled them with enthusiasm. If Moscow wanted 1,000 enemies found, they'd find 2,000. Parallel to this came the national operations: Poles, Germans, Latians, Finns. Entire ethnicities branded as breeding grounds for spies. Stalin's logic was paranoid. But simple. War was coming with Germany and Japan. The Spanish Civil War had shown him how fifth columns operated behind the lines. Better to kill 100,000 potential traitors than risk one real one. He explained it in a speech that year. Building a railway bridge takes thousands of workers. Blowing it up takes 3 people with dynamite. Therefore, the 3 must be found and destroyed before they even think about dynamite. Find them among the Poles, find them among former officers, find them everywhere. The archives reveal Stalin's handwriting goal over the terror. He read interrogation reports daily, scrawling instructions in the margins. Beat Unlefer, not naming the Polish agents. Just it. Beat him. Beat Volta. Keep on digging and cleaning out this Polish spy filth. His pen authorized torture as casually as signing a memo. Between 1937 and 38, approximately 1.6 million people were arrested. 700,000 were shot. That's 1,500 executions every single day for 18 months. The killing happened in forests, basement, prison yards. Trucks running their engines to drown out the gunshots. Bodies trucked away in the darkness. The party devoured itself. The 1730 Congress delegates, the ones who worked Stalin in 1934, were almost entirely eliminated. The Red Army's command structure was destroyed in the Tukhsky affair. Marshal Tukhachevsky and his fellow officers were accused of working with Germany. The evidence was forged, but they died anyway. The army that would soon face Hitler lost most of its experienced commanders. Every institution was gutted. Scientists, writers, engineers, doctors. The director of the Moscow Zoo was shot as a wrecker. How does one wreck a zoo? It didn't matter. The accusations had their own logic. If someone was arrested, they must be guilty. If they were guilty, their colleagues must be guilty too. The circles widened endlessly. Late 1938, Stalin suddenly stopped the terror, like turning off a faucet. He arrested Izhov, the security chief who'd carried out his orders, and had him shot for excesses. The period became known as the Yehovshchina, Yehov's time, as if Stalin had been an innocent bystander to his own massacre. The Great Terror achieved its purpose. Every potential alternative to Stalin was dead or broken. A new generation of fascists had risen, owing everything to him. They'd participated in the killing, making them complicit. The Soviet Union was now populated by people who'd learned to denounce their neighbors to Stalin had created the perfect totalitarian state, held together by shared guilt and mutual fear. Chapter 15. The General, Isimo. August 23, 1939. The world turned upside down. Joachim von Ribbentrop landed in Moscow to sign a pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The two ideological enemies who'd spent years denouncing each other as the ultimate evil were suddenly partners. Stalin raised his glass at the reception. "I know how much German nation loves its Führer. It should therefore like to drink to his health." The secret protocols carved up Eastern Europe like a wedding cake. Poland would have split down the middle. The Baltic states would fall into Stalin's sphere. Finland, part of Romania, all promised to Moscow. Stalin had bought time to prepare for war he knew was coming while gaining territory without firing a shot. When Hitler invaded Poland on September 1st, Stalin waited 17 days, then sent his troops to claim the Soviet share. For 22 months, the partnership held. Soviet grain and oil flowed to Germany. German technology came back. Stalin deported or executed Polish officers at Kin Forest. 22,000 men shot in the back of the head. He absorbed the Baltic states through rigged elections. When warnings came about German invasion plans, he dismissed them all as British provocations, designed to drag him into war. June 21, 1941, a German sergeant named Alfred Liskoka swam across the Bug River and surrendered to Soviet guards. "The invasion begins at dawn," he said. Stalin read the report and scoffed. Could it be that the German general sent us this defector to provoke a clash? When more warnings arrived, he issued minimal defensive orders. Don't provoke the Germans. Maybe this was a misunderstanding. 4 a.m. June 22nd, the phone rang in Stalin's Dhaka. Zhukov reported German planes bombing Soviet cities, tanks crossing borders. Stalin said nothing, just breathing on the line. Finally, "This is a provocation by the German military. Do not open Ferretto. Avoid unleashing wider action." He still couldn't believe his partner had betrayed him by noon. The scale of catastrophe wasn't undeniable. 1,200 Soviet planes destroyed, most never leaving the ground. German armies advancing 60 kilometers into the Baltic states, 40 into Belarus. When Foreign Minister Schulenburg delivered Germany's declaration of war, citing threats to their eastern border, Molotov could only stammer. Why did Germany sign an inauguration pact only to break it so easily? Stalin refused to address the nation. He sat in his office, growing small as somehow. Zhukov later remembered the shock to Stalin, caused by the enemy invasion, was so strong that his voice even became softer. Molotov gave the famous radio address instead. "Our cause is just. The enemy will be crushed. Victory will be ours." Empty words will let the frontier armies disintegrated. June 29th, news arrived that Minsk had fallen. Stalin visited the defense commissariat, exploded at his generals. What kind of general staff is this? What kind of chief of staff? Zhukov burst into tears and ran to another room. Stalin left telling his companions, "Len left us a great legacy. We, his heirs, have pissed it all away." Then he disappeared to Hista for 2 days. The Politburo found him on June 30, sitting in an armchair, looking somehow shrunken, when they proposed forming a state defense committee with him. Asherman, he seemed surprised they weren't there to arrest him. He accepted, slowly returning to himself. On July 3rd, he finally addressed the nation. Comrades, citizens, brothers and sisters, not the usual formal greeting. This was a plea. This is a matter of life and death of the Soviet state. The disasters continued through 1941. In September, Stalin refused to evacuate Kiev, despite obvious encirclement. 450,000 Soviet troops were trapped. He later admitted to Zhukov, "Your report back then was accurate, but I did not understand it correctly." By October, with Germans approaching Moscow, he sat alone in his office, food untouched. "What are we going to do?" He, as Skedwova would listen. "What are we going to do?" October 15th, panic gripped Moscow. Officials fled, burning documents. Workers looted shops. Stalin nearly executed, but decided to stay. On November 7th, he held the traditional Revolution Day parade in Red Square despite recent bombing. German armies were 40 kilometers away, but Stalin promised the troops that Hitler's Germany would collapse within a year. 1942 brought order number 227, not one step back. Panic-mongers and cowards would be shot on sight. Penalty battalions formed from disgraced soldiers sent to die in the mass dangerous attacks. From January to October, 5.5 million Red Army soldiers were killed, wounded or captured. Stalin was learning generalship through an ocean of blood. Stalingrad changed everything. November 19, the counteroffensive began. By February 2nd, 1943, Powers' entire army had surrendered. Then came Kursk in July, the largest tank battle in history. Stalin even visited the front, his only such visit, ordering celebratory artillery salutes for liberated cities. Tehran in November 1943. Stalin met Churchill and Roosevelt as he secured promises for a second front in France, which finally came on day, June 6, 1944. By July, he was parading 57,000 German prisoners through Moscow, washing the pavement clean behind them. The Berlin offensive began April 16, 1945. Stalin pushed it forward a month early, accepting 360,000 casualties to take the Nazi capital Berlin. The Americans arrived. When Hitler's suicide was confirmed on May 1, Saint Stalin seemed almost disappointed. "So, the bastard's dead. Pity we couldn't take him alive." At Potsdam in July, Stalin stood as Onuf, the Big Three, carving up the post-war world. The boy from Gori had become a star of half of Europe. But victory hadn't softened him. Returning from conquered Berlin, he told his inner circle that gratitude was a dog disease. The generals who'd won his war would soon learn what that meant. The camps were already preparing new spaces, fourth heroes of Stalingrad and Berlin, Chapter 16. Forging the Iron Curtain. Victory hadn't brought peace. Millions of Soviet soldiers had seen Europe, its cities and farms intact. Despite the war, they'd seen how people lived without collective farms, without constant fear. They came home expecting something better after all the blood. Stalin saw this hope as poison that needed immediate antidote. November 1945. Stalin coined a new crime, kowtowing Toth West. A ruthless fight must be waged, he declared Ogenstabsquaseness toward foreigners. The campaign would teach Soviet citizens that everything good came from Russia. Everything foreign was corrupt. Russian scientists had invented the radio, not Moroni. Russians had discovered devilry worth discovering. The Westerford only decay. August 1946, the cultural terror began. Stalin's enforcer, Andrei Danov, attacked Stalingrad. literary magazines for publishing ideologically impure work. The targets were carefully chosen. Mikhail's beloved sadist was denounced for spreading brutish. Anna Akhmatova, perhaps Russia's greatest living poet, was called a nun in whom licentiousness is combined with prayer. The Jordan of Sheena, as it became known, spread through every cultural institution. Writers, composers, filmmakers faced judgment. Shostakovich and Proop were condemned for formalism. Their music too complex for the masses. Scientists who cited Western research were fired. Geneticists who believed in genes rather than Stalin's pet theorists were arrested. Culture became a wasteland of patriotic slogans. The war heroes faced their own purge. Marshal Zhukov, savior of Moscow and conqueror of Berlin, was too popular. June 1946, Stalin struck. A formal order accused Zhukov of losing all modesty, claiming credit for operations that belonged to Stalin alone. The marshal was exiled to a minor district command. Other generals were arrested in the trophy case, accused of looting German art. Their real crime was being loved by their soldiers. Meanwhile, Stalin was building his empire in Eastern Europe. The Red Army had liberated these countries, and liberation meant permanent occupation. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany. Each got its own communist government, its own secret police trained by Soviet advisors, its own show trials. Local communists who'd fought the Nazi underground were replaced by Moscow-trained puppets. Only Tito refused to kneel. The Yugoslav partisan leader had liberated his own country, commanded his own army, and wouldn't take orders from Moscow. This split came in 1948. Stalin was stunned. "I will shake my little finger," he'd said, "and there will be no more Tito." But the finger shook, and Tito remained. The hunt for Tito's began immediately. Every Eastern European Communist Party was searched for secret sympathizers. Hungary's Laszlo Raj, Bulgaria's Trakostov, Czechoslovakia's, all executed after show trials wherever he confessed to being Western spies. Titoists, Zionists, whatever Stalin needed them to be. The satellite states learned their lesson. Independence meant death. June 1948. Stalin blockaded Berlin, cutting off Western access to their sectors of Thessaly. He wanted to starve them out, force them to abandon Berlin entirely. The Western Allies responded with airlift, flying supplies day and night. The blockade failed, but the message was Europe was now divided. Churchill would call it the Iron Curtain, while Stalin played imperial games. His own people starved again. The 1946 harvest failed partly due to drought, mostly due to the collective farm system. 1.5 million died while grain was exported to the new city. The victory that was supposed to bring relief had brought only new forms of suffering. The Iron Curtain trapped those on both sides. Chapter 17. The Tyrant's Last Terror. Andrei Zhdanov died in August 1948, and the vultures began circling before his body was cold. His death upset the delicate balance in Stalin's court. Beria and Malenkov saw opportunity. They whispered to Stalin about a conspiracy in Leningrad, Zhdanov's old power base. Small things at first, an unauthorized trade fair, some irregular bookie, but Stalin knew how to grow seeds into forests. The Leningrad affair began with administrative violations and ended with executions. By September 1950, the charges had mutated from protectionism to espionage. Nikolai Voznensky, the brilliant economic planner, the young Central Committee secretary, both shot after secret trials. Hundreds of others connected to Leningrad were swept away. The post-war generation of leaders was being methodically destroyed. Stalin turned next on his oldest comrades. Molotov's Jewish wife, Paulina Smolina, was accused of connections to anti-Semitic Jewish nationalists. Stalin forced Molotov to divorce her, then made the Politburo vote on her expulsion from the party. Molotov abstained. That single abstention was an act of defiance. Stalin would never Molotov had to write a groveling apology, begging forgiveness for his weakness. March 1949. Both Molotov and Mikoyan were dismissed from their ministries. These men who'd been with Stalin since the Civil War were now learning what their loyalty was. The campaign against ruthless cosmopolites intensified. Jewish writers, scientists, theater directors, all purged. Stalin told his inner circle that any Jewish nationalist was an agent of American intelligence. They feel obligation to the Americans. He explained as if revealing a scientific law. The madness reached its peak with the doctor's plot in late 1952. Prominent Kremlin physicians, most of them Jewish, were arrested for allegedly plotting to murder Soviet leaders through medical malpractice. Stalin personally directed the investigation, ordering his security to use torture. Beat them until they confess, he said. Beat them like dogs. While orchestrating terror at home, Stalin was playing global chess. He'd given Kim Il-sung permission to invade South Korea in 1950, then pushed China to enter when the Americans intervened. The war bled America while costing Stalin nothing. He advised the Chinasato drag it out. This war gives the Americans headaches, he told Joe N. Have patience. October 1952, the 19th Party Congress, the first in 13 years. Stalin expanded the Politburo massively, diluting the old guard's power. He publicly humiliated Molotov and Mikoyan, accusing them of cowardice and weakness. The stage was set for a new Great Terror. Lists were drawn up. The cattle cars were ready, but the old man's body was failing. His memory slipped. He confused names, forgot faces. The strokes were coming more frequently. March 1st, 1953, the final one arrived. The tyrant who killed millions, died gasping on his darker floor while his terrified courtiers watched, too frightened to call for help until it was late. Epilogue, the ghost of Stalin. March 1st, 1953. Stalin had dinner with his inner circle, telling stories. Forcing them to drink, they left at 4 in the morning. By noon next day, his guards grew nervous, no movement from his rooms. But Hodard enter uninvited. Finally, at 10 that night, they found him on the floor, soaked in his own urine, barely breathing. A cerebro-hemorrhage had exploded in his brain. Beria, Malinov, Kushov, and Bulganin arrived at the Darka. They stood around, dying tyrant, terrified he might recover and punish them for seeing him helpless. Hours passed before they called doctors, while Stalin lay unconscious. They were already dividing his empire. On March 5th, even as he still breathed, they abolished his newly created presidium and stripped him of his posts. 9:50 p.m., March 5th, Stalin's daughter, Svetlana, watched his final moment. He suddenly lifted his left hand. She wrote, Isto pointing to something above, and bringing down a curse on them all. Thenething, the man who'd ruled Thrauta for 30 years, was gone, leaving Bend a nation that didn't know whether to weep or celebrate. Moscow erupted in genuine grief and secret relief. The crowds at his public viewing crushed each other in panic. 109 people died trying to see his, the terror continuing even after his death. But the secret police also reported other reactions. A railroad worker was arrested for saying a dog's death. Good that he died. The man said maybe the collective arms would end and life would get. His heirs moved with stunning speed to dismantle the machinery of his Finitor. Within a month, the doctor's plot was declared a fabrication. Theist physicians were released. The Gulag population was cut in half through mass amnesty. Torture was formally banned. The massive reconstruction projects that had consummate budget were halted. An armistice was sought in Korea. But Stalin's ghost wouldn't die so easily. His system had created millions who benefited from it. Party officials with their special stores. Urban workers fed by grains stolen from peasants. Veterans who credited him with victory over fascism. The terror was gone, but structures remained. The collective arms, the one-party state, the empire in Eastern Europe. Decades later, in post-Soviet Russia, that ghost would rise again. Politicians willed invoke his firm hand, his great empire, his victory over the Nazis. The millions dead would be forgotten, or justified as necessary sacrifices. Polls would show young Russians admiring the strong leader who made their country. This is Stalin's most dangerous creation, not the terror which died with him, but the myth which lives on. The image of the wise leader making hard choices for the nation's glory. It tignas the Ukrainian villages wherever yon starved, the Polish officer shot at Katyn, the countless ordinary people who vanished into camps. This forgetting, this willful blindness is that somewhere sometime in ether, Stalin waits to be born.